we turn to the fourth opposition speaker to continue the case for the opposition in tonight's debate, Ella Whelan.
Thank you very much for having me tonight, and we'll see what the two brain cells in my head can come up with over the next 10 minutes. There is nothing new about the idea of no platforming. In fact, no platforming as a policy on campus itself has been around for decades. It was instituted first by the NUS back in the 70s, and Tom Slater from Spiked, my colleagues, has written a lot about this. And it was in its origin of quite relatively specific. It was quite specifically about fascists, which in the 70s was, quite a much more of a very real threat in politics than it is today. But it was also, as the years went on, began to include things like, things like Zionist societies or Jewish societies. And indeed, in 1977, the Jewish Society itself was told that it couldn't hold an Israel week, it couldn't have any speakers from Israel. And in 1986, the SWP's Lindsay German wrote about the fact that she was worried about this expansion, SWP being one of the political groups that was central to the NUS's campaign for no platform. So they realized years later in 86 that actually this expansion of no platform to include more and more speakers, more and more groups, more and more types of speech in its ban was a problem at South Bank, what used to be South Bank Poly. Groups of Black students were no platformed for listening to tapes of Louis Farrakhan. In 2001, fast forward to then, Eminem was banned at Sheffield University because of his offensive lyrics. And in the last 10 years, we've had no platform policies on campus instituted to, in one way or another, stop speeches from Julie Bindel, a serious feminist, from third-rate comedians like Dapper Laughs, from political activists like Peter Tatchell, from politicians like Amber Rudd. All of these people have either been no platformed or banned or snubbed or called too dangerous to speak in one way or another. And of course, it doesn't, as many of the speakers who've gone before me have mentioned, the motion tonight doesn't just necessarily pertain to no platform on campus. In fact, I'd argue that the idea of no platforming, though it might have begun as an NUS policy in the 1970s, has expanded to become basically tantamount to censorship, to what we now call, many people call cancel culture in wider society. And in the last number of years, though banning people has happened throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, there's been an acceleration of censorship, call it cancel culture, call it no platforming, call it whatever you like. For example, Nick Buckley, who was the leader of a charity in Manchester, was dismissed by the charity for posting post about Black Lives Matter, then reinstated despite the fact that his post was not racist in any way, shape or form. It merely was criticising Black Lives Matter. Gillian Phillips, who was a children's author, was dropped by her publisher for tweeting in support of J.K. Rowling, and some people have mentioned the discussion about trans issues and the tensions of that political debate. And Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP, was sacked by Keir Starmer, caused huge amounts of controversy because she retweeted an article by Maxine Peake, the actress and Labour activist, who within the article had I think you could probably call it a less than true statement about Israeli soldiers and their practices. So the issue of censorship and cancel culture and no platforming and crackdowns on free speech might have begun as a perhaps in some ways laudable desire to combat very serious political threats, be it fascist or otherwise, but has expanded pretty much since the word go to now encompass all political aspects, from left or right, extreme or banal. I mean, just as a point of sort of sad and rather bitter irony, the SWP are now learning the lesson of the history of their position on free speech, have been taken off of Facebook alongside Donald Trump for being a extreme political party. I mean, that is the extent to the attacks on free speech today. Not even has attacks on censorship relegated to the 20th or the 21st century. This book by Mick Hume, Trigger Warnings, got a fantastic history of free speech in it. And he points to John Ball, who was a radical priest in 1381, who was excommunicated by the church for preaching to the people in the English vernacular. And he had this phrase that has been quoted throughout the years, throughout the centuries. John Ball posed the question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And what he was really saying was getting to the heart of the question of free speech, which is that who is allowed to decide what is said, who is allowed to decide what is and isn't offensive. Now, when John Ball was talking, no, thank you. When John Ball was risking his free speech, he really was risking something, because he was killed. His head was stuck on a pike outside London Bridge as a warning to anybody else tempted to speak out against, and then quote from that time, the great lords of the realm. The great lords of the realm, we might not be talking about kings or queens or despotic monarchs or totalitarian regimes. But it's interesting that in such a benign, such a safe, such a regulated space as a university campus, just as a side note, I think it's very telling that the proposition have continued to most people actually, most of the speakers have continued to talk about university as if it was a place where students come and access a service in this kind of customer and service provider relationship, which, you know, I think a university is one of the reasons why university experience has deteriorated. I think it is supposed to be a place for free ideas. It's supposed to be a challenging public open space, not a private company that gets to institute policies on the people paying for a service. But in that idea of the great lords of the realm, the idea that student union presidents who are, I can tell you from, I remember my days at Sussex, are not mass elected, do not hold the support of the mass of the student body, in fact are not even independent after the 2010 Charities Act, are answerable to university administrations. I would be very suspicious of placing my trust in allowing those people, whether it be communications officers, student unions presidents, or in fact just loudmouths on campus, trusting them with the decision of who I can and can't invite as a speaker. Because I think this is one of the key points that I think have been missed, and Claire picked up on this, is that the idea, someone towards the beginning floated this idea that what no platforming really just is about not passing the mic. It's just about, or I think it was Kate said, is not paying someone to put forward an opinion. And it's fundamentally missing the point of what no platform is. No platform is a preemptive measure. It's something that says, it's not just, as Claire says, something that actually after the fact cancels people. It's a preemptive measure. It gives a list saying, these are the people you are not allowed to invite. And in fact, the reality is on many student campuses today, there are policies in place which say you have to pre-vet speakers. You have to, as many people who have been student organisers on here will know, you have to submit speakers far in advance. And a lot of the time you get refused to allow permission for those speakers to be able to come to campus. So this is a preemptive measure, which means that it is essentially asking people to self-censor. So it's not about passing the mic, it's about saying you're not allowed to have any access to any resources as a student organizer wanting to put a debate on campus, unless the speaker that you're inviting is vetted on the basis of the subjective political desires of the people in charge. I think that's fundamentally wrong. It's undemocratic, and it's quite clear an exercise in censorship. And I also want to challenge this idea that it's simply about a small policy, that cancel culture or no platforming, or whatever you want to call it, is just simply a kind of a small aspect. And what's really the problem? I remember when I was working at Spiked, and when we were running the Free Speech University rankings, we would often be laughed at by NUS members and other people who disagreed with the idea that there was a free speech problem, as creating a storm in the teacup, as really making a big song and a dance about nothing. But actually, if we look at the wider, in wider culture and wider society and wider discussions about politics, the now knee-jerk reaction for "you can't say that," the growth of this really quite infantile idea that words harm, that words are as bad as actions, that students need to be protected as adults in a free and supposedly free and open society, proves that when we were making a fuss about free speech 5 or 10 years ago, we actually, even ourselves, didn't know the scale of where this was going to go. The difference today, I think, is that we often are living in bad faith. I think that a lot of the time, rather than in the 70s when the NUS and others said, yeah, we're banning these people and there's no space for them and we are not going to give ground. Now there's a kind of desire to hide behind what really is censorship and say it's not really about censorship, it's about lifting up the voices of minorities, or it's about making campus a safe space, when really no one wants to admit that what they're doing is being cowardly in the face of adverse opinions, and actually being cowardly about, as Claire pointed out, their own ability to win the argument. As has been mentioned previously, and I'll sort of end on this point, there has been fuss about one of the speakers here coming to join in the debate, and there often is. And I think when you get people who are defending free speech, we often tend to be those who are willing to take rather extreme positions, because you have to have guts to be able to talk about free speech and defend free speech. So I want to just read a short quote from one of my political heroes, James Connolly, who, there's 2 quotes I want to read to you. The first one was he was talking to his daughter in 1915 after he had been berated by a priest for supporting striking dockers in Dublin at the time, and he was kind of going off on a rant to his daughter Nora, and he said to her, "We mean to be free, and in every enemy of tyranny we recognise a brother. Wherever be his birthplace, in every enemy of freedom we also recognise our enemy. Nora, we demand free speech for ourselves. We must grant it to others, even though their opinions are different from ours." And I'll finish on this, a second quote from the Workers' Republic, which is a paper he organised and wrote for in 1915. He said this, which I think is just, I mean, it was written in 1915, it's as relevant today. "The liberty of the public meeting is also rapidly becoming a thing of the past in Ireland, as far as it may be used for the criticism of the activities of the government or its functionaries." And this is an important bit. "And yet it is this very right of a subject to criticise the governing bodies, be they the government at the time or student union bodies, which is the very essence of a freedom in a constitutionally governed country. Without the freedom of the press and the right of public meeting, there is no citizenship. There are only the relations of subject and rulers, of slaves and slave drivers. The question of whether the press is not right or wrong in its criticisms, or whether the public meeting does or does not advocate wise measures or use wise language, has no bearing upon the matter." I think if we try and encapsulate and remember the bravery of someone like James Connolly and the bravery of the people that are standing for free speech today, and try and emulate that bravery and have the courage of our convictions, we'll realise that no platform is actually a block on any kind of progressive politics. And if you really want to make change in society, as some of my previous speakers have said, you have to grab the bull by the horns and support free speech.